Welcome to the Reinventing Transport Show, the international podcast that helps you push for better urban mobility and better cities. Today I'm talking with Todd Litman, who's based in the city of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. Our focus today is why and how metropolitan transport planning can be made more comprehensive and multimodal. As founder and executive director of the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, Todd has produced a huge volume of analysis on a wide range of transport problems and solutions. Todd has a special talent for bringing specialised and technical ideas in transport and planning to a larger audience. One example is the blog he writes at the Planetizen website. He generously shares much of his work via the VTPI website. If you find the interview useful and interesting, please do visit the show notes, which you'll find at reinventingtransport.org, and then share the link on your favourite social media. Enjoy the interview. So, Todd Litman, welcome to the Reinventing Transport podcast. Thanks very much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me, Paul.
Todd, I've been a big fan of yours for many, many years, and you tackle a huge range of issues. We couldn't possibly talk about them all, but let's focus today on why and how metropolitan transport planning can be made more comprehensive and multimodal. So the first question is, what do you mean by comprehensive and multimodal transportation planning?
One way to think of it is many of our current planning practices favor motorized transportation, or specifically automobile transportation, over other modes. And because most of the other modes, that is walking and bicycling and public transit and ride sharing, tend to be more resource efficient and affordable, this means that our current practices tend to favor less efficient and less affordable transportation systems. Many of the practices that do that, I think, they're subtle. The way we measure transportation system performance, primarily from the perspective of vehicle traffic speeds and flow, and motorist convenience through policies such as making sure that there's a generous supply of parking at every destination. And the way we allocate funding tends to favor spending $1 on a roadway improvement over spending that same dollar to improve walking or bicycling, and in a lot of cases over improving public transportation. So much of my research is exploring the degree that our policies and planning practices are biased in favor of motorized transportation at the expense of other modes. And similarly, a lot of our urban planning and urban development policies favor more automobile-dependent sprawl over more compact infill development. And so a lot of my research examines those policies and the costs that result.
So some of those outcomes are political preferences, and they are threshed out in debate. But one of the interesting arguments you mentioned just now was that conventional transport planning does a poor job of even noticing some of the alternatives and does a poor job of counting them properly. So one of the things you've emphasized is multimodal sets of transport indicators so that transport planners and the general public as well in the political debates can at least be measuring these things and understanding the situation more accurately. Can you talk a little bit more about that aspect of your work?
Sure. So the traditional way that cities evaluate transportation system performance, as you well know, is using something called roadway level of service. That measures the ease of driving during peak periods. In order to do that analysis, most cities have developed sophisticated traffic models that examine or measure the travel demand between different zones. One detail is that the zones are big enough that they count very few of the walking trips. And the travel surveys that we use to what we call feed the model, a lot of those travel surveys they greatly undercount walking and bicycling. For example, if you walk to a bus stop and ride the bus and then walk to your destination, walk to your work site, most travel surveys would code that as a transit trip. The walking links are invisible. Similarly, if you drive and let's say to save money, you park 6 or 10 blocks away from where you work, you park at a free parking space or a cheaper parking lot. And so you walk the last link, that's coded as an automobile trip. And the walking link is not counted. So most travel surveys, at least in North America, suggest that the vast majority of trips are made by automobile. Depending on the location, you might say somewhere around 85 or 90 or 95% of all trips are made by car. And that gives policymakers the impression that there's little need to invest resources in walking and bicycling. So that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. We devote resources to improving automobile traffic speeds and widen roads, provide generous amounts of parking. All of this the result of public policies. And in doing that, we create communities where it's fairly difficult to get around without a car. And the price profile of automobiles is it's a challenge because the majority of vehicle costs are fixed. So it's expensive to buy a car. And once you decide to buy a car, you're going to be spending several $1,000s a year at least in depreciation and registration and residential parking costs and other fixed costs. And so when you wake up in the morning and you're trying to decide how to go to work, most people would feel that it's rational to drive. It would be foolish to leave your car at home and take the bus because, in fact, taking public transit often costs more than the marginal costs, that is the fuel costs and any parking costs of driving your car. So once we reach the point where most households feel the need to own a car, and in many cases, a car for every driver or every adult in the household, it makes perfect sense to use that car as much as possible in order to get your money's worth. And those factors all come together to create what I would consider to be, or what my analysis indicates, is economically excessive automobile travel at the expense of the more resource-efficient and healthier and safer modes of travel.
You've, of course, got many suggestions for antidotes to these ills, but two of them that perhaps came up just now. So one of them is the converse of these car-dominated, auto-oriented indicators would be multimodal indicators that can hopefully prompt planning to be more multimodal. And the other one is an antidote to some of those cost issues that you talked about is comprehensive analysis. So let's talk about the multimodal indicators first, and then perhaps you could talk a little bit about how comprehensive analysis can overcome some of these misunderstandings about costs and benefit.
Right. So the good news is that during the last decade, a number of multimodal level of service indicator systems have been developed. And so now if a community does want to measure pedestrian and bicycle and public transit level of service, it's perfectly feasible to do. And that's great because this information is often presented graphically. A transportation agency will produce a map with color coding indicating which roads are good for driving. They'll indicate the roads with poor roadway level of service with red, and then the ones with moderate roadway level of service will be blue, and the ones with good level of service will be green. And in the past, that directed all of our transportation dollars to expanding roads in order to improve the roadway level of service. Well, now we can do exactly the same thing for other modes of transportation. And so planners would be able to say, for example, that although the roadway level of service for cars is only LOSC, for, let's say, walking, its level of service D, and for bicycling, its level of service E. And so you would say to a policymaker, before we spend more money improving conditions for driving, let's make sure that we first devote our resources to improving walking and cycling level of service in order to create a more multimodal transportation system. So that's one of the steps that I think is critical. It's a critical foundation for creating communities that are truly multimodal so people can get around without having to drive everywhere.
So that was multimodal indicators, and it sounds a very promising thing. How about comprehensive analysis? That's a theme in your work, and it's one that I think people perhaps have trouble getting their heads around. Why is comprehensive analysis so important in your work?
Right. Well, transportation planning decisions have many direct and indirect impacts, economic, social, and environmental impacts. And so, of course, it's very important to consider all of those impacts when making decisions. Planning is interesting. Pretty much every year, we find some emerging issue that communities are interested in, that somebody in a community is interested in, and planners have the job, the responsibility of understanding those issues and incorporating them into decision making. So, for example, during the last few years, we've seen energy planning and pollution emission reduction planning and active transportation planning and parking planning and healthy community planning and affordability planning. And there's resilience planning is another emerging issue. Frequently, when one of these issues comes up, there'll be a whole bunch of excitement concerning how to incorporate this particular new issue into the planning process. And that's great. I like to incorporate all of them so that instead of getting into an argument over which specific issue is the most important, I think it's better to start off with the assumption that we want to incorporate all of these issues into our decision making. And for planners, that's actually good news because it means that there's always job security. There's always an emerging issue that if they become experts on emerging issues, that they will be in demand, that is job security for planners, because these emerging issues are important. Issues like incorporating health objectives into transportation planning, or finding new ways to solve parking problems, or dealing with sea level rising and the risks. All of those are interesting and challenging and important issues. And if you become the local expert on that subject, you can become famous and rich, or at least, well, it's not always lucrative, but sometimes it makes you famous and rich. Is that true, Paul?
Within certain circles, we have a certain fame within certain circles. You and I,
exactly. I guess. But that's good. That's a very rewarding role to play, is to be part of the emerging issue that the rest of society is realizing is important. So let me just give you an example. Conventional transportation project economic evaluation, that is the benefit cost analysis that determines how transportation agencies are going to spend their money, will often compare the cost of a highway with the cost of building and operating a public transit system. So they'll ask, what's cheaper, building and operating a train line or expanding the highway? And that analysis overlooks some very important impacts, very important costs. In order to use a highway, you need a car, and you need a driver, and you need the fuel for that car. And that car is going to need a parking space at every destination. And those are all costs that are avoided if somebody uses public transportation. So if instead of widening the highway, we put in, let's say, a bus lane, instead of 2,000 people, 2,000 commuters driving to work, you have 2,000 commuters arriving by bus or by train. Those 2,000 commuters no longer need a personal car, and they're saving on their fuel costs and other vehicle operating costs, and they don't need a parking space at their destination. So a comprehensive analysis when comparing highways with public transit improvements, when making an investment decision, would compare the cost of the public transit with the full costs of building the road, plus the cost of all the parking that those vehicles are going to need, plus the cost of the vehicles, and plus the operating cost of the vehicles.
One more aspect of this comprehensive analysis that I've found very useful from your work over the years is your work using comprehensive analysis puts the congestion costs and benefits of a road project into a much more clear perspective. You've argued that congestion is typically overemphasized and weighted too highly. And if you have a much wider range of costs and benefits considered, congestion wouldn't justify anywhere near as many projects. Is that inaccurate?
Certainly. I don't claim to be the only researcher that's examining these issues. But what's very clear is that the conventional approach, that is, the traffic models that are currently used to predict the severity of traffic congestion that will occur in the future if nothing is done, and that predict how much congestion will decline if the roads are expanded, those are technically inaccurate. That is, they fail to incorporate the feedback that occurs if we fail to expand roads. The traffic congestion tends to reach equilibrium. It gets bad enough that it discourages some people who might take an automobile trip from doing that during peak periods. They'll shift the time that they're going to drive, or they'll shift the route that they would take from a congested to an uncongested route, or they might shift modes, especially if public transit has grade separated routes, so it's actually faster to get around by bus or train than by driving. Or they might shift destination. They might say, it's too congested for me to drive across town to go to the big box store. I'm going to do some shopping in my neighborhood. So we know that traffic congestion increases to the point of equilibrium, that the congestion delays discourage some trips, which means that if you don't expand the roads, it's inaccurate to claim that congestion will simply get worse and worse. It'll get bad and then level off. And if you do expand the road, you get a significant amount of generated traffic, that is additional peak period vehicle trips that would not otherwise occur.
You have a sort of an annual or maybe every few years ritual of critiquing one of the various publications that come out. There's a publication from the Texas, I forget the name, the
Texas Transportation Institute's Urban Mobility Report.
Yeah, so you critique that. And so perhaps could you speak a little bit about what are the one or two or three key points in your critique of their alarmism about?
Right. So there's another detail about this issue that I think is important, and that is the commonly used indicators of congestion. That is what's called the travel time index and variations of it are designed to measure congestion intensity. That is, if you did decide to drive during peak periods, how much slower you would go compared with if you made that same trip during off-peak periods. And this does make large cities, dense cities look bad. That's where you get the most intense congestion. But if you measure congestion based on per capita congestion costs, so you ask how many hours of delay would a typical commuter experience in a city, taking into account both the intensity of congestion, but also the number of times they're making a peak period car trip. It turns out that it's the sprawled automobile-dependent cities where residents, and in particular commuters, are spending more time delayed by congestion than in the denser but multimodal communities where it is very difficult to drive, but people simply don't take as many peak period car trips. Where because you've got alternatives, you can take public transportation, and the travel distances are shorter. So when you do drive, you're traveling maybe 5 kilometers rather than 10 to work. As a result, it's in the sprawled automobile-dependent areas where congestion costs are actually greatest. And from an economic efficiency perspective, it's actually the congestion cost, not the congestion intensity, that's most important.
Yeah, and the baseline of what is considered to be normal and expected traffic conditions is an interesting assumption there, isn't it? Because they're assuming that free-flowing traffic is the expected condition, where in a city you would not actually ever really expect free-flowing traffic except in the middle of the night in a dense city.
It's even worse than that, because in many cases, the baseline that they use is much higher than the speed limit. So part of what they define as the congestion costs is actually what a traffic safety person would call speed compliance. That is, not driving faster than the legal speed limit. There are a couple other ways that that these studies often exaggerate congestion costs. One is that they use a excessive value of travel time. When a situation occurs where travelers have a choice between, let's say, a faster road that's tolled or a free road that is more congested and slower, typically about 20% of people are willing to pay a significant toll to go faster. But the majority of travelers are quite price sensitive. And if the toll is more than about a third of their wage, they'll say, no, I would rather save money than to save time. And so in these situations, we have good evidence that the real value of travel time for most travelers, most commuters, is somewhere around 25 to 35% of their average wages. But in a lot of situations, these travel cost and congestion cost analyses use much higher values. And so they're making congestion seem much more costly than what consumers would actually pay, are actually willing to pay in those situations. And there are a number of other technical details that I think the analysis uses. For example, they assume that the congestion causes very large increases in fuel consumption and pollution emissions, when in fact a moderate degree of congestion, that is the congestion that's most common, that slows you from, say, 100 kilometers an hour to 60, actually reduces pollution emissions and fuel consumption. I'm not saying that roadways should never be expanded and that roadway projects are always futile, but my analysis does suggest that in many, many cases, there are much more cost-effective solutions that are better for everyone overall, rather than spending more money to continually try and expand roadways in congested urban areas.
Is this kind of vision something that's only for urban places and for places that already have some prospect of having mass transit? Or is it something that you would suggest is for everyone across all of metropolitan areas, people who are perhaps currently living a fairly car-dependent life? What's in it for them? They might say this sounds all anti-car. How can we appeal to someone who's maybe politically conservative, used to using a car, Why should they care about a multimodal perspective?
Right. That's a great question, Paul. And I have done quite a bit of research on this subject. So let me assure you that residents of suburban and rural areas have every reason to support more multimodal planning and more comprehensive analysis. For example, in suburban and rural areas, motorists, and typically they're the parents or the adult children of seniors, motorists or drivers spend a very significant amount of time chauffeuring non-drivers in their families. And that is a cost. In fact, my analysis suggests that the amount of time and vehicle operating expenses devoted to chauffeuring non-drivers in automobile-dependent communities is far greater than the time and incremental vehicle costs associated with traffic congestion. So if traffic congestion is a problem because it causes delay and increases vehicle operating costs, then the additional chauffeuring costs, so chauffeuring burdens imposed on motorists in automobile-dependent areas is an even greater problem.
You've got the bumper stickers, don't you, of mum and dad's taxi service?
Sure. And certainly many people, many parents certainly enjoy the time they spend chauffeuring their children, or it's not always bad, but there are certainly many situations where both the chauffeur and the chauffeuree would rather have alternatives. So, for example, in the past, the majority of children got to school under their own power. They would walk or bicycle to school. When I was young, about 80% of children got to school on their own. Now, in many North American communities, it's down to about 20%. We've had a flip in the portion of children, of young people, and this includes adolescents. This includes, let's say, a 12 or 14-year-old or even a 16-year-old has to rely on somebody else in their family to chauffeur them around. Why does that happen? Do children now have fewer feet? Is there a shortage of feet, Paul?
Not that I'd noticed, not lately.
No. And most adolescents that I know, they love the independence of being able to get around by walking and bicycling and public transit on their own rather than depend entirely on mom and dad to drive them around. Some chauffeuring is perfectly reasonable. But if you live in a small town or a suburb, very likely you would appreciate it if the planners in your community made an effort or made sure that the community is doing what's needed so that people can get around. Children and seniors and anybody that likes the exercise of walking and cycling, and any dog that wants to be walked. So I think part of the justification for improving active transportation, that is walking and bicycling in communities, it isn't just for people, it's for their pets on a leash who really want to get around. There are many good reasons. Another very good reason is that even if right now you can afford to own a personal car and you are physically able to drive, there's a chance that sometime in the future, you're either going to become poor or you're going to have a disability that will require you to rely on non-automobile travel modes. And so another reason that I think residents of automobile-dependent communities should support improving alternatives is preparing for their future self. That there's a chance that 5 years or 10 years or 20 years in the future, you're going to be dependent on wheelchairs or on walking or on public transportation. So you should start improving those options for your future self. It is partly self-interest that motorists should support better options, both to reduce their chauffeuring burdens, but also in preparation for their future self. Another associated issue is affordability. In order to own a car, in order to drive a car, most motorists would have to spend several $1,000s a year in fixed costs plus the operating costs such as fuel. So the rule of thumb is that affordability means households spend no more than 45% of their total budget on housing and transportation combined. For low-income households, that is, people in the first and second income quintile, it's a strain to own even one car. Or to put it differently, for a lot of households, particularly low-income households, being able to get around without a car is a great increase in their economic freedom and reducing financial stress and giving them economic opportunities. So even if, for example, if you're a moderate income household, let's say a couple with some children, you want your spouse to be able to stay home. You want to live on one income. Being able to get around with just one car may give you that freedom that you would feel slaves to your jobs if you needed two cars, but being able to get by with just one car gives you that freedom that, let's say, your spouse can go to part-time work or become a full-time stay-at-home parent. That is a huge opportunity for many families. It's only possible, that ability to go from two cars to one car, or maybe from one car to zero cars and become a car-free household, that's only possible if you live in a community with at least moderately good walking and bicycling conditions and moderate public transit and some inner city travel options. So, for example, when you do need to visit family members in another city, that you do have some mobility options to do that. It's not unreasonable. It is not an extreme request to say that households should be able to get by without everybody owning a personal car.
That leads me nicely into a final question. When I look around, I'm in Singapore and I work a lot in Asia, and as grim as the transport situation is in many parts of Asia, I see a lot of energy and activity to change things in, broadly speaking, the right direction, because the crisis is so severe. It's obvious that we have a problem and we need to do something different. I'm less optimistic in some ways in places like Australia, where I'm originally from, and North America, Canada, the US, where people are generally relatively complacent about their car-oriented lifestyles. So I was wondering if you could point to one or two or three cities, if you were to recommend someone who was interested in this issue to take a study tour to a city that you're familiar with, one that is relatively automobile dependent, but is turning things around and making a difference. Could you mention a couple of places?
Right. So there are some really good examples in North America. And I think really a surprising leader is the city of Seattle. So Seattle has invested in rail transit, but equally important, it's done numerous incremental improvements to the bus system. So the bus system is now operating efficiently and has become attractive to middle class or middle income commuters. So it is normal now for people working in the tech industry or people working in downtown offices to use the bus. And that's quite a breakthrough for North American cities. And as a result, what's very interesting is total transit ridership has increased significantly in Seattle during the last decade, and traffic accident rates have declined significantly during that same period. And that is a validation of some of my research, indicating that if we want safer transportation systems, that one of the most important components is to improve the travel options so that it's possible to get around without a car, particularly for the high-risk travelers. So particularly for young adults and seniors or people who are drinking or distracted, it's very important that they have travel options. And cities such as Seattle are doing some very good work to make that possible.
Todd Litman, thank you very much for being on the Reinventing Transport podcast.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
Don't forget, you can always go to reinventingtransport.org for more information, to listen to other episodes, to find out how to subscribe, or to leave a comment, suggestion, or question. Go to reinventingtransport.org. This has been the Reinventing Transport Show, and I'm Paul Barter. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.